anything is fair game tonight, so if you have a question about something you've seen recently, in fact, that would actually be a useful tack to take, something you've seen or heard that you've never seen or heard before, and you want to try and describe it. Description of the sounds is kind of like taking your car into the shop and, you know, what's wrong with your car? I don't know, but it goes clunk, 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 beep or whatever. And that's not very hard, not very easy to interpret. But sometimes that's the case too with animals, and some of these things make sounds that you just don't expect to be coming from the animal in question. If you've never heard porcupines, for example, in the woods, then you'll know what I mean. They just make some bizarre sounds for an animal that you wouldn't think capable of making such a sound. Same thing with hungry barred owl chicks and a few other things that are more common than you might think, but just make some really strange sounds in the woods that are hard to figure out. Going back to the diversity a little bit and the number of species, beyond just the fact that there are a lot of species out there, there's tremendous variation within the species in terms of not only their size, the kind of parameters you might think about, but also such things as abundance. Some of these animals are widely distributed throughout the entire state and can be incredibly abundant. Some of them, on the other hand, we can't even seem to come to grips with the fact that whether we have them or not. Whether there's a lynx in Wisconsin at any given time is arguable. Whether there's a cougar in Wisconsin at any given time is arguable. They've certainly come through the state. They've been documented now on trail cameras, which is another major innovation in terms of sorting all this stuff out. If you have any questions on your property about something you're hearing or seeing, put out a trail camera if you haven't, and you'll capture images of all sorts of stuff that you didn't know was there, including your neighbors creeping around your property at night, and all sorts of other weird stuff. But the DNR is now coordinating a major statewide project using volunteers with trail cameras that the DNR is providing to capture thousands of images in a very organized fashion across the state to document particularly rare mammals, but also other things that we have a hard time figuring out anything about their status. So it's really kind of a neat tool that's also just sort of popped up in the last decade or so. I don't know why I'm bothering to ask, but I will. How many of you have used a trail camera around your property? Oh, less than I thought. Okay, so there's some room here for the rest of you to jump in on something that your colleagues are just getting started on. But it truly is amazing, not only the quality of pictures you can get, but the things you'll see that, oh, I didn't know that was anything anywhere around here, and species interacting with each other as well. Especially the rare stuff. Some of these things are very hard to get a handle on, but all of a sudden the pictures turn up and the pictures don't lie. Sometimes the people taking the pictures do, but we have to try and sort that out. Once you know where the camera was, the camera doesn't actually confuse the issue. Okay? All right, so on this notion of identifying stuff, or the litany of stuff that's out there, any particular burning questions that have been bothering you about something that may or may not be around, or any fictitious animals or things your neighbors have said they've seen that just seem implausible, or something you couldn't identify?
Yeah, the cougars, you know,
The cougar situation, you know, for a long time until the advent of trail cameras, the cougar question was the bane of my existence. You couldn't go to a talk, you couldn't get on the radio board, somebody would call and say, yeah, I saw another cougar the other day. Jeez. And then that all came to a screeching halt in, I think it was 2002, with the Milton cougar. Or was it, well, I think it was more recent than 2002 actually, but that animal was seen a few times south of Madison, and in the process of tracking it, one of the DNR guys found a drop of blood in the snow and cupped a handful of snow with the droplet of blood in it and stumbled back to the truck and actually got that specimen collected and analyzed, and the DNA proved conclusively, yep, it was a cougar. And since then, that and other DNA samples, you know, more modern technology, have concluded that all of these animals, and by all I only mean 5 or 6 that have been documented in Wisconsin, came from western South Dakota in the Black Hills, and they're all juvenile males heading out across the countryside. So that mystery has been put to rest. The next one will be when and if other sex and age classes, primarily females, make it to Wisconsin, and there's some evidence of reproduction, which to date there is not. So, yep, cougars walk through occasionally, but in terms of any population, not very likely. So that has been put to rest, yes.
What's the similar status on bobcats? Are they around very much?
Bobcats are doing reasonably well, and their big shtick over the last few years is that they're moving down the western part of the state and getting into this country with increasing regularity. So the driftless area population is doing pretty well. There are other animals that have been moving south too. Black bears have been moving more and more south. Fishers have been moving more and more south, but unlike the other two, bears are doing really well. Lots of bears. Fishers, on the other hand, have begun to wane a little bit from a tremendous population explosion after they were reintroduced latter part of the last century. There were fishers all over the Northwoods. It was a common sight to see a fisher cross the road, and people blame them like they blame some other animals that they consider somehow bad, that fishers were to blame for everything from eating the household pets to bad TV reception and all sorts of other things. So none of that was true, but in the area where fishers were really abundant, they've begun to wane a bit, but they have extended their range. Kind of like the wild turkey situation. You know, I don't know what you people are observing around. There's still a lot of turkeys, don't get me wrong, but there just doesn't seem to be nearly the turkeys that there were 10 years ago, when you'd see just huge flocks of them in the winter, and that's reflected the last 5 years. The harvest has been down from the 2012 peak, and even with more permits and more hunting opportunity, they're still only killing roughly the same number of turkeys. But that's what happens when an animal gets into essentially a new and open environment and just kind of goes nuts and overshoots the mark and then starts to settle back down a little bit. The one they hope that happens to, and it doesn't seem to be happening yet, are of course the elk with the restoration program in the Northwest, and now the new releases up near Black River Falls. Those elk are currently, the new ones are sitting in a pen waiting to be released probably in June. Yes, sir.
In the vein of declining population, what do you see as an emeritus professor the reduction in the budget and the number of scientists working in natural research?
Well, what the heck, I'm not working for anybody anymore. I can say whatever I want. What are they going to do, fire me? I think it's an unfortunate situation when decisions about resource management are not being made by informed, scientifically based or scientifically informed individuals who are trained and paid to do that, but rather the decisions are being made by legislators who are maybe well-meaning, but can't be expected to have the insight and knowledge of the situation that somebody who is trained and hired to do that has. So that the motivation is the squeaky wheel getting the grease, and somebody's upset about who knows what and goes to their cousin who's in the legislature. This just can't happen. It's an outrage, and all of a sudden we've got a new regulation that had little or nothing to do with any type of study, survey, investigation, or anything else. So that's not saying that everything that's happening is ill-advised or bad, but even if something good is done, I still object kind of the way it's being done. I guess I'm not sure that's going to get any better anytime soon. Some of the things that are being done will take a long, long time to recover from. So, yes, sir.
How far south are the wolves coming?
The wolves are here. They're all around us. The bottom line is I wouldn't rule out seeing a wolf anywhere in the state of Wisconsin. But down here, what you're seeing are dispersing individuals, kind of like the cougars coming from the Dakotas. And they move tremendous distances just like the cougars. So we've had wolves from central Wisconsin found in eastern Indiana and points even further away. So in terms of them actually living or frequenting an area or a pack becoming established, it's still a little bit north of here.
Would you expect that with climate change over the next 25, 50 years, that certain species would move out of this area and go north, and some species that are more like down towards Arkansas, Missouri, southern Illinois might be moving up this way?
Well, that's certainly the current thinking, but among the scientists who are working with it. But again, in the political arena, there's not even agreement that climate change is a real phenomenon. So yes, it's quite possible that things that have happened even over the last century, like possums getting here, which happened about 100 years ago, armadillos are actually working their way slowly northward. They're a long way from Wisconsin, but who knows? Sure, those kinds of things could happen. I think there are species that are more sensitive that they're more concerned about. For example, among our fisheries, among our cold water fisheries, brook trout, for example, which are very dependent on cold, clean water. As the water temperature increases, then that's one animal that I've heard speculated could certainly move north, if not disappear altogether. That's going to be a long-term thing, but as with many of those kinds of things, like chronic wasting disease, if you don't eventually draw a line in the sand and say, hey, we got to put an end to this, it just becomes a slow, insidious creep until, what happened to all the brook trout? And then it's too late. Yes, ma'am.
When something like a cougar passes through here from the Dakotas, does anybody know where they go? And if they're not setting up housekeeping here, where do they end up?
They usually end up dead.
Yeah.
The Milton cougar ended up shot by the police in Chicago. After it milled around southern Wisconsin for a few weeks, it crossed the border, ended up in an alley in Chicago, and a cop shot it. Which, for an animal that size in a populated area, was probably the only thing that was the prudent decision. But nevertheless, that was the end of that cougar's dispersal. But there have been others that have moved through that have made it all the way to New England.
So there,
I guess they get to the Maine coast and say, well, there's no place to go, and maybe turn around. But they, first of all, while they may find suitable habitat, if they're looking for fellow cougars, that's not going to happen. So,
are they collared or tagged in any way that people know that cougar made it to New England?
Some are.
Yeah.
Some are. And again, once they have a dead animal in Maine, for example, the genetics tell them from where it came, marked or otherwise. Yes?
What's the status on white nose syndrome in our bat population? Last year we heard it was pretty grim.
Well, it's here now. It finally got here winter before last. It took 10 years ago. No, not quite 10 years. It took about 8 years. It was discovered in New York in 2006. And it was discovered here in the winter of 14. So about 8 years to get here from New York, which was inevitable. But Wisconsin's bat people, to their credit, had time to do a really good job of documenting where the caves and hibernacula, mine shafts, and so forth were, and implement regulations on people using those items for caving or exploring or whatever, and requiring sanitizing clothing and all the stuff they thought they could do to minimize its impact when it got here. But what will happen now is anybody's guess.
So
It's not good.
Is there not going to, because of the lack of science-based positions now in the Wisconsin
I don't think that
DNR, are they even watching it?
Yes, there's a really good group of bat people. Sounds like Batman and his Robin, but they're a really good group within the Bureau of Endangered Resources, now the Natural Heritage Group, who have been at this since day one with bats, and they are doing everything they can to keep an eye on things and doing a really good job of monitoring bats in Wisconsin. But whether there's anything they can do to stop it, other than just monitor what's happening and how many bats are being lost, remains to be seen. Okay, so, yes, sir.
Just to follow up on the bat issue, if I can.
Go ahead.
Cleaning out the flower beds and things just the other day, I noticed right below a bat house, there was 2 dead brown bats on the ground. Would that be?
That probably is unrelated. White nose is a winter problem in their hibernacula, and they don't overwinter in our bat houses. So if you found dead bats in that situation, or despite my Herculean efforts to take care of the fireplace in my place up in Price County, invariably, by the time I'm up there next week cleaning out the firebox, there's 7 or 8 bats dead in the firebox that have gotten trapped in there. So, and that has nothing to do with white nose syndrome either. So, bats are vulnerable to a lot of incidental problems. Last question for the time.
On the bats, Mississippi Valley Conservancy has an opportunity to purchase Kickapoo Cabin, which has been closed to the public for some time, and they're hoping to raise the funds to set that aside and not have it bought out to be commercialized again. It's right in our neighborhood.
Well, anything that can be done like that to gate or protect what hibernacula are known to be out there will help, but it will only help in that it keeps people from further transmitting or spreading the disease problem through their own activities. We'll see what happens. Okay, so before we get too far off, these are all good questions and it's all interesting stuff, but let me backtrack to this notion of, we know our resource base, 500 and some species. Every one of them in its own right is an interesting little animal. They all do that on a daily basis. That wood frog, or a short-tailed shrew, or a redstart, or whatever, every day those animals, even though they're small and somewhat nondescript and go unnoticed and unloved, every one of them does the same thing in an average 24-hour day that a deer or an elk or a black bear or a cougar is doing. They're trying to find food, they're trying to avoid being eaten or run over, and they're trying to find a mate and so on and so forth. So the opportunity for folks who are interested in wildlife is to deal with or study or take a look at all this smaller stuff that's right at your doorstep and pay perhaps a little less attention to, gee, I wish I was up north chasing wolves or whatever. That's kind of over-glamorized in some cases. So these animals are all out there. And armed with the field guides and the strategies that we had and a little bit of homework with the field guides or on the internet, you can learn all the tricks of the trade to, for a frog, for example, not just identify the frog if it's sitting in your hand, but identify the calls of the frogs, which you probably all know. The wood frog is the subtle quacking on the various, do we have something out there we should be identifying?
Or crane.
A crane.
Sandhills.
See, wildlife surrounds us. But anyway, the point being, whether it's the animal itself, you can see why Janet Jackson had problems with these things. Anyway, the animal itself and the physical characteristics of these animals is one thing. But in the case of frogs, you can also identify them from the egg masses, and there are field guides to that. And you can also identify them from their larval form, the tadpoles. All the species look a little bit different. All tadpoles are not created equal. So with a little government field guide to egg masses, larval amphibians, or a guide to the frogs, or a tape, what's that? Or you call up the sounds on the internet, you got 4 options for identifying that one simple little amphibian in the case of the wood frog. So again, it just takes a little bit of effort on your part to sort these things out and to use the resources that are there for you. And by doing a little bit of the detective work, what I mean is learning a little bit on that frog, a little bit about their topography. So when a field guide is talking about its toe pads for things like the tree frogs, or that fold of skin that runs from the eye down the back, the dorsolateral fold, or the big eardrum, the tympanum right behind its eye, or a few other features, once you know what the lingo of the field guide is, it's really no trick to identify these things. And with only a dozen frogs, they're so distinctive in most cases that really isn't much of a problem. The amphibians and reptiles are pretty straightforward, even the snakes. And with the snakes, you learn a little bit about the scales on the lips and on the head, which are all named and actually correspond if you get into mammals and you think skulls are kind of cool. You learn the different basic bones of the skull, which we share, of course, or the dental formula, things like that. You learn a little bit about that, and you realize that the names of the scales on a snake's head actually follow the names of the primary bones in a mammalian skull. So that all of a sudden, if you were trying to identify a hog-nosed snake or a bull snake, the field guides will tell you to look at the rostral scute. The scute is a scale, and that's the scale right at the end of their nose, which would be the rostrum on us. Nose is a rostrum, or on a mammal. So you find that little scale, and on a hog-nosed snake it's upturned, like a pig snout. On a bull snake it's heavy and triangular as they force their way through the debris and dirt as they're burrowing. So again, we can't, time's slipping away, we can't in the time we have obviously go over the identification tricks for 500 animals, but the point I'm trying to make is, armed with your field guide or the resources available to you, read the preface and the introduction so you understand what the basic playing field is on these animals and what kinds of things you look for in terms of adaptations or shape or whatever else, and you should be able to identify any one of these 500 and some species. It's not that complicated. And as I say, most of them are readily available to you. Most of these things are widely distributed. Most are available to you to pick up and collect and put in a terrarium or take pictures of. And of course, that's another tremendous advantage with everybody carrying a smartphone. Oh, what's that? Click. Ship it off to me on email. What's this? And within 8 or 10 weeks when I get around to reading it, you've got an instantaneous response that it's a thus or so. So that's made life a lot simpler for folks too. You just call it up on your phone, and instead of talking to somebody and saying, yeah, I saw this weird thing, and you're trying to describe it, nobody does that anymore. Then, up there it is. Boom, it's identified for you. Okay? So that's the deal. Now, the next point that I think will be a little more entertaining, because I want you to participate here, is the notion that all of these animals interact with each other. They're not all out there in a vacuum. They're all interacting with each other in a variety of complicated ways. Well, some not so complicated, but some reasonably obtuse. And so I've got a laundry list of these things, but we'll start out from the floor. And you tell me what you think you know about as an interesting interaction between these species and either other species of animal life or their habitat. So what kinds of things might we talk about? Lay it on me.
We witnessed a flock of cedar waxwings in the winter, landed in an oak tree, young oak tree that still had its leaves, late in the evening. Those birds, each one curled up into one leaf. And the next morning, we got up and looked at them with the binoculars, and we could see their little heads sticking out.
Oh.
Well, that's certainly not one I'd expected to hear. Seeing is believing, and there are all sorts of things that these animals do that really is the basis for them being of such interest to people, because it's hard to predict what they're going to do, and when you think you've got them figured out, you realize that you don't. You think, well, I'm going to put this really nice nest box out here on the pole. The bluebirds will love that. But they don't. They nest in an old can that somebody threw off the road, and that's what they nest in. So their unpredictability or creative behavior like that is a source of endless joy and curiosity, I guess. Well, think of some of the basic ones. What's the most fundamental interaction between one animal and another? They eat each other. That's the bottom line. Everybody out there is a potential dinner for somebody else, except for a very few that are kind of at the top of the heap. Everybody understands the old basic concept of a food pyramid or a food chain, and that's the way it works. In your farm pond, the minnows get eaten by the bluegills get eaten by the bass, and on up the line. So the predator-prey relationship is a very basic one. And it's very, well, it can be anything for people from a source of great wonderment and interest to just absolutely gut-wrenching. And depending on your point of view, you have to decide where you stand on the spectrum. Over the years, the predator-prey issues that I think have attracted the most curiosity are pretty easy to predict. One of the most apparent, since you all have a bird feeder, sooner or later you're going to have a Cooper's hawk. And when the Cooper's hawk converts your favorite cardinal into a snack, especially in plain view of the breakfast table, people can get just a little bit exercised about that. Some people, their attitude is, hey, everything's got to eat. Cooper's hawk's got to eat. Some people take a very different view of that, and the call usually goes something like, hey, this hawk is eating all my birds. What am I going to do about it? And that answer is, there are not a lot of answers to that question. At least, well, there are a lot of answers, but the legal answers are a much smaller subset of what your options are. But the Cooper's hawk and songbirds around the feeder is one. The wolves in northern Wisconsin eating all sorts of things, most notably deer and dogs, is another really interesting one. I talked about this the last time I was on the radio, but my neighbor sent a very nice picture to me via email taken from the ice back toward my house, and my dock was in the background, and there was the house, and there was a couple acres of ice between the dock and at the photographer's feet, a rolled up chunk of deer hide. And everything between there and the dock was completely flattened and covered with blood and deer hair. 7 wolves had come out on the ice, killed the deer at the end of my dock, then consumed it, left nothing but the hide and the remaining, well, the little blood and hair, and then there were the other photograph. He turned around, there were 7 sets of wolf tracks headed across the snow on the ice across the lake. So how does someone react to that? On the one hand, oh, that's amazing, look at the great pictures, that's pretty cool. My wife's reaction was a little different. She said, well, what about the dogs? With 2 labs, a black one and a yellow one. I said, well, what about the dogs? She said, is this a problem? Could be. Wolves kill 20 or 30 dogs a year in northern Wisconsin. Most are trailing hounds, particularly bear hounds, when they run through wolf territory. But every year there's a certain number of pets and bird dogs that are killed as well. And that causes all kinds of trouble. Bad press for the wolf population. Something on the Channel 12 News in Rhinelander where they interview they've got mom and dad and then the 2 kids, and the kids are holding a little bit of spine and an ear. And this is all that's left of Goldie, our golden retriever. And everybody's crying and the reporter's egging them on, and it sets wolf management back by several years just from that one interview. But the predator-prey situation, without belaboring it, is a big deal. Everything gets eaten. The stuff on the bottom of the heap, the meadow voles and the rabbits and so forth, are eaten by everybody. The further up the heap you go, the more complicated it gets. But predation in general is one of the biggest concerns now in deer management in the North Woods, where they've now determined or realized that bears are very efficient predators on fawns. Wolves are very efficient predators on adult deer. And the bobcats and coyotes and assorted other things get in on the act too. So predation is an important factor that needs to be considered probably more than it was as far as deer management is concerned. All right, so predator and prey, what else you got?
Well, this may be an extension on that, but one of the biggest predators out there is us. When I was a kid, my dad grew up on a farm, and the only good chicken hawk was a dead chicken hawk. Has that mentality changed dramatically from your view?
I think it has. I think the days of the only good hawk is a dead hawk, and you know, I could be wrong, but the last few years that I was working, I just didn't hear as much about that kind of stupidity amongst people in terms of killing raptors, in terms of, you know, kids out with a 22 or a BB gun shooting turtles off the basking logs and songbirds off the feeder and whatnot. Either everybody kind of figured out this is something we ought to clam up about, except people are not very good about clamming up about stuff, or it really truly has diminished, and I'd like to think it's the latter. So that seems to help a little bit.
Just the other comment that I remember Dad talking about is they killed every coyote that they could find. This is down in south central Kansas. Killed every coyote they could find, killed every hawk they could find, and then wondered why the jackrabbits ate everything inside. And it just kind of shows you that to me has always been a good example of the balance of nature, I guess you would say.
Well, the reality is that the root cause of most problems related to wildlife populations and management is not the animals themselves or their environment, it's people. And the one that never ceases to amaze me, and it's an interaction, is how many animals we squash on the highway. Millions of them. And yet people hardly bat an eye at it. It's the normal reaction. People may feel a little remorse. Oh, I just hit a rabbit. But rather quickly, just like that, it's replaced. That stupid rabbit running across the road. You know, it wasn't my fault. And away they go. And nobody is going to give up their cars or slow down because of the carnage on the highway. But it happens regardless of the species, their rarity, their importance, or whatever else. They get killed on the highway. And that's also a fact of contemporary life, but it really doesn't get much attention, other than from the insurance companies trying to settle up for deer vehicle collisions. But the otters, the beavers, the woodchucks really took it hard on the way out tonight. I saw lots of dead woodchucks that have been out now. But again, nobody pays much attention to it. It's just kind of considered bycatch. Yes?
We've lost like 30 chickens to something.
Mm-hmm.
They're just roosting up in the rafters of our barn, like 20 feet off the ground. And we've lost like 30 chickens, like 5 a night for like a few years. I'm just wondering what could be doing that.
There are lots of possibilities, ranging from raccoons and possums to horned owls and weasels and mink. If they're getting them up in the rafters, it's probably not the mink, but you know, all those animals, including fox and a host of other things, will kill chickens. And if you're not having any luck figuring things out, that's a perfect opportunity to deploy a trail camera, looking at where your chickens are roosting and see what the heck you see. Or spread some flour or talcum powder in the area leading up to where the chickens are roosting and see what you find for tracks. So in any event, the first thing to do is figure out the culprit, then you can figure out what to do about it.
We set up tracks and we mostly just got like raccoons and like weasels, I think. Like, no weasels. Like, possums. Raccoons and possums.
Well, there's a couple of culprits to start with. Both are very abundant and have no business in the barn where the chickens are. All right, so the predator-prey situation, let's put that aside. Let's come up with some other ones. There are some other really good relationships to think about here.
any type of cooperation? I know like, really what I can think of is like when a predator walks through the woods, lots of different animals will call, make calls of distress or whatever, or warning. But is there much cooperation between species?
Well, there are plenty of examples of communication and cooperation within a species, whether it's a flock of geese that's got somebody keeping an eye on things, or a group of turkeys, or a host of other things. But generally, most animals are tuned in to the distress or warning calls of other animals so that they know when there's trouble around, whether it's a hunter or a predator or something else. Let me try and think of any other example of cooperation I can think of between species. You know, some things will not necessarily, it's sort of inadvertent cooperation. For example, if something's feeding on a school of fish, bigger fish, for example, just tearing them up and there are bits and pieces of fish around, then birds like gulls and other things will take advantage of that situation and become part of the feeding frenzy. Some others.
What about invasive species crowding out natural, like carp moving into an area and wiping out natural fish species?
Predation is a big one. The next big one is competition. You don't necessarily kill or eat something, but what they do competes with other species. And that's one of the reasons why deep down some people don't like wolves. They view them as competitors, especially for a shared resource like the deer herd. Any deer that the wolf eats is one deer less that I'm not going to see or somebody's not going to see in the woods in the fall. So competition of all sorts is another big one. What about beneficial? I just mentioned an animal that I saw a number of dead on the road. Think about that woodchuck, for example. Where do they fit into the scheme of things? What do they do that's helpful?
They burrow, they create really nice burrows for other animals to take advantage of.
There are a few of our mammals that are considered primary excavators, things like woodchucks, and a few others that are excellent diggers, fox, woodchucks, and a few others. And those burrow systems, when they're either abandoned or even when they're still in use, provide habitat for a whole slew of other animals. If you think in the bird world, got a big old tree that's just recently died. It's the same thing with the primary excavators in a dead tree. Get a pileated woodpecker in there and start it opening up all sorts of chambers, and pretty soon the wood ducks are nesting in there, and the mergansers, and all sorts of other things. So we've got habitat modifiers. What's another good example of a really good modifier of habitat? Beaver. Creating beaver ponds and changing the flow pattern of streams and the temperature regime. And for a while creating good trout habitat and then destroying trout habitat. Now we're in the spirit of things here. How about some more good ones?
I would say like parasitism with American eels, with trout and salmon.
Yep. Certainly, so we've got predation, competition, parasitism. Got a couple of examples of things benefiting the others. Scavenging, for example. There are lots of things that benefit from what's left of a wolf kill or bear kill or anything else after the main predator has killed something. Lots of other things move in and clean them up. Or the vulture is cleaning up those woodchucks I saw dead on the road. What else? There are some cases of symbiosis or two things living together like the old algae and fungus thing. It's more common in the plant world. On the subject of plants, we talked about predators as far as animals eating animals. What about animals eating plants? If you throw in things like insects and you end up with pollination and whatnot, that's a big deal. But what animal, of all the animals we've talked about, which one has the most impact on Wisconsin? Deer. There's no question about it. And it's not just the fact that there's a whole slew of them, or that the wolves are eating them, or that hunters are hauling them home. It's the fact that, in a day's time, each deer eats about 8 pounds of vegetation. Do the math, 1.5 million deer. Of course, we don't talk about deer numbers anymore. That's not right. That upsets people. So we stopped doing that. But before we stopped, the herd averaged around 1.5 million. do the math on the amount of tonnage of vegetation that's consumed every day in the state.
It really hurts reforestation.
It hurts reforestation, it hurts our wildflower populations, it hurts agriculture. There are all sorts of problems out there. So deer are what are referred to as a keystone herbivore that has the capability of influencing the habitat for all other species. And where deer are really abundant, like they are here, or in Wapaka County, where they claim their density is now 135 deer per square mile, all of a sudden, at much lower densities, usually the trigger point is 20 or 30 deer per square mile before you start to see impacts on all the other species because of deer browsing. So small mammal communities, salamander communities, songbird communities, characteristics of tree age classes all begin to change because of deer browsing pressure. Not to mention the agricultural problems and the deer vehicle collisions. We're starting to sneak past, so Sadie, cut us off whenever we want here, but we're teasing out some good stuff here. All right, so we got deer out of the way. You've been very patient, sir. What would you like to say?
Different question. On the aspect of deer, since we went to Texas to get a deer czar from Wisconsin, you've been down to Texas the last few days, consulting on deer herd down there?
What about the deer herd down there?
Are you consulting in Texas the last few days?
No, I was getting ready to set up some hunting awareness classes for the employees of Texas Wildlife and Parks. But I was in Austin, and that's Dr. Deere is from Stephen F. Austin University, and I was sorely tempted to go to his office and poke him in the eye, but I didn't have time. So, any other interesting interactions? Let me see how close we came to dealing with my list here.
But also beneficial, the birds and mammals that eat insects and ticks and stuff like that, mosquitoes.
They eat things that bother us. They disperse seeds. They fertilize the ground. There are all sorts of things. So the take-home message is, before we look at the list here and see what we missed, we have a wonderful wildlife diversity here. It's quite possible to learn the tricks of the trade and use the resources available to figure out what they all are. And once you figured out who the players are, then you can get to know them a little bit, and they're all incredibly interesting once you do learn how they live and where they are and how to find them. And then, on top of that, they have all these interesting interactions among each other, among themselves, including interactions with you. And that involves everything from you serving as a predator, as a hunter, to you serving as a food source by providing artificial food, or to you as a source of habitat by putting up nest boxes or other types of structures, or planting shrubs that produce food, or manipulating your forests. There's all sorts of stuff going on that makes dealing with these animals particularly interesting. Now let's see, we got the predator stuff out of the way. We got the one major pain in the neck, the white-tailed deer. We got the habitat impacts of beaver, the primary excavators. The impacts on people, we didn't talk about very much, but I think you get the idea that some people are having serious problems with these animals. So whether it's human injury, which is possible with some species, disease interactions, a mole in your lawn, a woodpecker on your siding, or raccoons in the chicken roost, there are all sorts of things that can cause problems for people. The scavengers we talked about, the disease interactions we mentioned briefly, parasites we hit. There were only two others that I had, and they're a little obtuse. One is what I, for lack of a better term, called mythical associations. And these are things you tend to hear about in our local taverns, like the DNR moving rattlesnakes around the state to control wild turkeys, or assorted other things like that. Or, for example, when turkeys were first restored out here in the mid-70s, and not very far from here, there was a great deal of concern that, I don't know where we were in the grouse cycle at that point, because grouse have taken a terrible nosedive in the southwestern part of the state anyway, but a lot of that diminishing return on grouse, which were a popular bird, was blamed on turkeys. And for a while, it was not uncommon to have people swear that they had I saw the turkeys eating a grouse nest. It was just terrible to see. They ate all the eggs, and then they killed the hen and ate her. That kind of thing, you just have to kind of shake your head and nod and smile and move on, because it's just very difficult to combat the kinds of things that get circulated in our taverns and neighborhoods and so forth. Trying to think of what was precipitated when the turkey restoration occurred. Turkeys took off in a hurry, and we conducted a mail survey of farmers in southwestern Wisconsin in terms of what kind of problems they were having with turkeys. And I came into the office one morning, and there was a guy standing by my door with about a 10-year-old boy, and he looked very distraught. And I said, "Hi, can I help you out?" He said, "Yeah, I need to." He was carrying a copy of the survey we'd mailed out. And I said, "What's the problem?" Well, he said, "I got your survey, and I drove over here from wherever it was, Lafarge or Viola or somewhere over in this part of the country. Anyway, he said, I got to talk to you about this." And, "Well, come on in and sit down." I said, "What's the problem?" "Well," he said, "these turkeys, this is my boy, and I wanted to leave the farm to him, but," he said, the turkeys are just going to wipe out everything on the farm." And I said, "Well," I didn't know what to say for a minute. And I said, "Well, how many turkeys do you have on your farm?" I'm thinking this could be a good place to hunt. But I didn't tell him that. But I said, "How many turkeys are you seeing?" And he said, "This is one of the most amazing things that ever happened to me in the office." He said, "Well, I haven't seen any turkeys yet." I said, "You haven't seen any turkeys? But you're worried you'll have no farm to..." "Yeah," he said, "You know, the guys down at the feed mill and the bar, they've convinced me that the turkeys will be the end of my family farm." And he was almost in tears. I said, "Holy mackerel." So that's kind of the level of frustrating misinformation that gets passed around. So, you know, I urge you to take the time to learn about these things, enjoy them, but try and get the facts straight, and, you know, then move forward and do what you can to help wildlife out. All these animals have lots of problems these days with habitat issues and climate change and who knows what, but everybody's got an opportunity to do some good stuff. Now, I think everybody's familiar with the field guide issue. There were just a couple of others I wanted to mention. On the reptile and amphibian front, there's a Peterson field guide to reptiles and amphibians. There's all sorts of others, but if you don't have them, the 3 DNR publications on the 3 groups of reptiles and amphibians are collectively less than $10 and really good and really current in terms of understanding and identifying those particular animals. The mammals and birds have pretty good field guides in general. The checklist of vertebrates that the DNR put together, I don't think you might get lucky and find this in hardcover like this, but you can also get it off their web pages, and it provides basically a giant checklist of all of the vertebrates in the state, including the fish, and you can kind of maintain your own logbook or checklist in terms of what you're seeing. This is the little USGS field guide I mentioned to larval and egg forms of our reptiles and amphibians, so that for each species, it will show you what the larval form looks like, a distribution map, and a little bit of general ecology. So armed with something like this and the 3 DNR publications, you can become an expert on the reptiles and amphibians in no time at all. There are some of the field guides, like Mammals of the Great Lakes States and Mammals of the Upper Midwest, include quite a bit beyond just pictures and range maps, include a much nicer ecological summary so you can learn a little bit about the animals in general. But my favorite of all are the 2 books by Mark Elbrock, Mammal Tracks and Sign and Bird Tracks and Sign. And this is all illustrated in full color, and better than any other reference I know, talks about tracks, droppings, scratch marks or claw marks or chewing or anything else you could think of that you might encounter in the field, and allows you to sort of figure out what's going on. And I've turned over the pages that look remarkably like what you were seeing. And I guess those pictures are around too if some others want to weigh in on what was probably happening in their yard. There are actually, much like the chicken roost, there are several possible culprits here, and you you need a little more information, but we'll get to that. I'll talk to you in a minute about that. All right, we're 10 minutes over, but the time went by quickly. I'm perfectly happy to answer a few more questions if you have any, so anything's fair game at this point. Yes, sir.
Just in general terms, compared to say the 1950s or so, has the diversity and population in general gone up, gone down, of just native wildlife?
Well, I don't remember much about the 50s. I was born in 81. It's a very good question. In most cases, I would make an argument that you always hear about the good old days. Oh yeah, back in the 40s, the sky was black with these and there were gazillions of these and whatnot. I think you could make a pretty good case that the good old days for many of our wildlife populations are actually right now, depending on what you want to talk about. There are still some endangered species. But some of the endangered species we get uptight about, like barn owls, for example, were never abundant here. We're on the edge of their range. Many other species that were in trouble have been brought back. Trumpeter swans, for example, have become, well, not abundant, but certainly common where they were non-existent. Eagles have come back. Loons have come back. And if you start to talk about game species, like Canada geese and deer, and a few others, some of those are all-time population highs. If you think about the continental waterfowl population, for the last 3 years, the duck population in North America has been higher than ever recorded since they started surveys in 1955. So there's a ton of ducks around. But none of these animals are uniformly distributed around the landscape. But you can find places where they're doing very well. A lot of the stuff that we don't pay much attention to, like squirrels and rabbits and things like that, that just seem to keep plodding along, are probably as abundant as they ever were. But there have been some changes in distribution, to be sure. And the easiest thing to do if you're interested in mammals, for example, is get a current field guide or the Herps books, and then compare those to references that were put out back in the time you're asking about. For example, Hartley Jackson's book, Mammals of Wisconsin, was published in 1959. So I'm particularly fond of flying squirrels. If you go to Hartley Jackson's book and look up flying squirrels, it'll have a range map and it'll show southern flying squirrels, the little guys, kind of down in the southern 2/3 of the state, and the northern several tiers of counties, northern flying squirrels, the bigger ones. So that was in 1959. Now, the southern flying squirrels are all the way to the Lake Superior shoreline, and the northerns are all but gone. It's only a few scattered populations in some areas in the northeastern part of the state. So some things have certainly changed. And some of that's because of the animals themselves. Some of it was facilitated by people changing the environment and developing the North Woods. And some of it may be related to things we don't even understand, like climate change that's been going on for a long time. So, yeah, there aren't that many things where you can look back and say, holy cow, we don't see such and such anymore. Or if that's the case, it's usually related in some way to human activity.
What other populations can CWD cross over into? I'm thinking dairy cattle, sheep,
None.
goats.
None?
None.
None. At least that's the party line. And but that's what the Brits told their people about mad cow disease too. So at least for right now, no one's demonstrated any carryover of anything to anything as far as CWD is concerned. But who knows? I'll just tell you that if that's the game changer, that if it ever happens and they find chronic wasting disease or some derivative of it like CJD, the human form, either in a person or a cow here in Wisconsin, then I can assure you that the response to CWD will be a lot different than it is now. Yes, sir.
Since we've been on the topic of interactions, I was just curious what your perspective is on Iowa Whale National Park. I know it's not in Wisconsin, But this is a really cool example of the trophic cascade effect, which you've kind of hinted on already with the extirpation of wolves there on park through the canine coronavirus. How do you feel about considering reintroducing the wolf back to our animals?
Well, I was there last September leading a tour, and the Park Service had just released their new fact-finding. We're going to poll all of our visitors and so forth and see what they think about the wolf and moose situation. In a nutshell, the wolves and moose have coexisted on Isle Royal for many years. It's been studied for 50 years, and it's just kind of a classic. The wolves eat the moose go up, down, and so forth. It's been really interesting stuff. But over the last few years, the wolf numbers have been just going into the tank. This past winter before last, they were down to 3 animals. And one of them was deformed, had a kind of a kink in its neck and a bent tail, and it died. So they were down to 2. I don't know if those 2 are still alive now. They may not be. 2 more came across the ice from Grand Marais, Minnesota, winter before last, wandered around for 3 days, apparently didn't like what they saw, and hustled back across the ice to Grand Marais. As things warm up and it's less likely there'll be solid ice on Lake Superior, they feel that the opportunity for more wolves to come in on their own is all but gone. The people from Michigan Tech who have been there studying the wolves have been badgering the Park Service to do something about this for years, that they could see the writing on the wall. But of course, government agency, things move slowly. Now that horse is sort of out of the barn. If the last 2 have died and they weren't going to do much to rebuild the population anyway, then wolves may be gone. And they're still collecting information. And I'm trying to think of where I saw it. I actually had it to talk about on the radio today, but there was a comment about the Park Service that by the time they're through with committees and collecting information and studying and writing reports and trying to decide what to do, it may be too late. But the only thing that they seem to agree that they won't do is allow any reduction of the moose population by anything other than disease or starvation. Whereas I thought there were some far more creative opportunities to keep the moose in check. If they're not going to bring wolves out, there were other things they could have done with the moose population, but they won't consider any of that. So I don't know what will happen. Eventually the Park Service will come out with a recommendation, but bringing out a bunch of new wolves, I'm not sure will be the answer. But it's a pretty neat place. How many of you have been to Isle Royal? Few. If you ever get the chance, it's a neat place to visit. Not that far away, except for the miserable boat ride from either Copper Harbor on the barge or from Houghton. I recommend going over from Houghton on the Ranger 3, which is a pretty big vessel. But once you get out there, it's there's no communication whatsoever. You're completely out of touch with the outside world, and there are darn few people over there. So if you just want to kind of get away from it all, that's a good choice. Okay, I think we better wrap this up. Oh.
I have one question.
Yes.
Do you have any tips on how to see a flying squirrel?
Yeah.
I mean, they're out
You
there.
find somebody who's got them visiting a bird feeder and ask them to invite you over after dark, and either they get them accustomed to a floodlight so you can illuminate the area, or if you start out and they're coming in, use a red filtered light, and that doesn't bother them, and then you just see them coming and going in the evening like birds. That's the best strategy because they're active and behaving, so you can see them. Other than that, people encounter them either incidentally when they get into your attic or walls, like any other squirrel, or when you're cutting firewood, knock down a dead tree and it shatters, and they were in there in a den. And you see them scrambling around. Anybody got them coming to your feeders? Nobody? Part of it, if you put 10 pounds of sunflower seed out at supper time and it's gone by morning, that's a good suggestion that you might have flying squirrels. And if you think that's happening or everything's getting disrupted and you know it isn't raccoons, then work a light so you can check periodically. They're really fun to watch.